On the 23rd of May 2022, over 500,000 16-year-old Sri Lankan children began their ordinary level examination. The entire country stands behind these children. Citizens are mobilizing themselves to provide them transport to exams. Hotels are offering up their premises so students can continue their studies without power cuts. The people's movement is scaling back on protests just to ensure that no exam-going child is inconvenienced. We adults remember the O-levels as the most difficult exam of our lives, and we feel for these children who are being forced to sit for these papers in near catastrophic circumstances. This O-level batch was just 14 years old and in grade 10 when the pandemic hit us. They had barely begun their first year of the exam syllabus. Their entire 2 years of the O-levels has been plagued with unprecedented challenges: closure of schools, worsening situations at home, mental and psychological breakdown, fuel shortages, transport crises, power cuts, economic desperation, political instability. Basically utter chaos in the country. We have a simple question to the government of Sri Lanka. What have you done to support children during the catastrophic events this country has faced since 2020? Now, this is a legitimate question because the basic responsibility of any government is to provide protection and guidance to its citizens at all times. This is their job. This is what we pay them to do. And state and government officials in charge of education are directly responsible for the children of this country. Sri Lankan schools remain shut for the longest duration in the world during the pandemic. More than 60% of our 4.3 million school-going children had no access to online education at all during this time. But in spite of this, the Sri Lankan government did nothing to ease the exam stress on children. It continued to conduct full public exams in spite of children not having access to schools. Let's examine all of this in closer detail. Now, you all remember how COVID-19 hit Sri Lanka in March 2020, right? On the 12th of March, there was an abrupt announcement that schools will close indefinitely. Schools then stayed closed for 16 and a half weeks. They opened on July 6th, but only for grades 5, 11 and 13. They stayed open for 5 days and then they closed for another 4 weeks. So this current O-level batch that is just sitting their exams started off by missing 21 weeks of school right at the beginning of their grade 10. Then on August 10th, schools opened, but only for grades 11 and 13. A few weeks later, all the grades above grade 4 were back in school, but most children were permitted to come to school only one day of the week. Schools stayed open like this for 25 days and then closed. Now, of course, the Sri Lankan government, like all other governments, was struggling with an unprecedented crisis. So let's give them some time to get their heads around this problem. By September 2020, the National Institute of Education in Sri Lanka had actually come up with a reduced syllabus of essential learning outcomes. And this was given to every grade up to the O-levels. Schools were instructed to adhere to this reduced syllabus. The O-level students would be tested on this rather than the entire vast exam syllabus. Now we are in October 2020. And after being open for 25 days, schools close again, so the government can conduct 2 exams, the 2020 A-level exam and the Year 5 scholarship exam. These exams are held during an island-wide COVID curfew. Children had to travel to their exam halls amidst great hardship. Back to our schedule. Schools that closed in October 2020 stayed closed till February 2021. Another 19 weeks. And when they opened, they did so for, guess what? Practice tests for the O-level batch above this one. Can you see the single priority of the Sri Lankan government emerging in all of this? Schools remain shut, the country is in lockdown, most children have no access to online education, but exams must continue. Back to our crazy school schedule, or should I say actually exam schedule, because we didn't have school, but we still have exams, right? It's 2021. Schools that opened on February 11th stay open for 12 days for practice exams. And then on March 1st, they close for 10 days so that the batch above this O-level batch has their O-level exam. We are now almost 1 year into the pandemic. Let's pause a bit and work out the average number of school days in a year. A local school is open about 195 days of the year. In 2020, schools were open a maximum of 55 days. And this means partially open, remember? So the year 11s who were forced to sit their first public exam actually had only 1/4 the amount of school days before they were sent up for their exams. Oh, and by the way, remember the NIE circular in September 2020 informing schools of a reduced syllabus? Well, guess what? In January 2021, 6 weeks before the O-level exams, the Ministry of Education announces that this reduced syllabus circulated by the NIE is invalid and that children, in fact, will be tested on the entire exam syllabus. The exam was not easy and children were failed. This is a good place, actually, to question the very need for the O-level exam. The A-levels, one could argue, give students the grading they require to enter university. But what does the O-level exam really do? Without it, based on school assessments, children can still transition into the A-levels. Many countries took such mature decisions on behalf of their students during COVID. March 15th, 2021. Schools have opened, but again only for grades 5, 11 and 13, exam batches again. Our current O-level batch have just entered grade 11 after having missed 40 weeks of school in grade 10. 40 weeks. Schools managed to stay open for 19 days before they closed for 1 week for the Sinhala and Tamil New Year. After this short holiday, they reopened for all students, but at 50% attendance. This means you take 2 weeks to cover the work you would normally cover in 1 week. Schools stayed open at 50% capacity for 21 days, and then on the 27th of May, they closed again. This time, they stayed closed for 23 weeks. This is approximately 115 school days. So, rough calculation. Our current O-level batch have been out of school for 63 weeks since March 2020. At best, they have had about 40 days of school since the beginning of their 2-year O-level syllabus. So, after this 23-week school closure that stretched from May to November in 2021, on November 1st, schools finally opened, but once again, 50% capacity. 29 school days later, they closed on December 23rd, and now we have made it to 2022. COVID seems behind us, but not our troubles. Already, since November 2021, there have been strange events, like the sudden power cuts and water shortages, which the government blamed on problems in the Nurachole power plant. As 2021 rolls into 2022 and January rolls into February, the President and the government continue to mislead the public on the impending power, dollar and fuel crisis. By 18th February, the government can no longer hold back the inevitable through their untruths, and scheduled power cuts begin to be inflicted on the public. Between February and March 2022, daily power cuts increase incrementally from 2 hours to 4 hours to 5, 7.5, 10, and then finally 13 hours. Amidst these power cuts, fuel and gas shortages, amidst the dollar crisis and the rising costs of living, families begin to fall apart. Children come hungry to school. Some children cannot even make it to school at all. Never in this first quarter of 2022 did the government ever prioritize the physical or psychological needs of the many children fallen victim to this widespread breakdown. In spite of overwhelming evidence of families plummeting into hunger and desperation, our political leaders continue to spend money on themselves, continue to rob the country of its reserves, and pull us into bankruptcy. However, in spite of power, food, and fuel shortages, during the first quarter of 2022, schools stayed open for almost an entire term. But then, April 1st, riots and curfew, schools close. April 4th, schools open. April 6th, fuel crisis, schools close. The Ministry of Education, maybe we should just call them the Ministry of Exams, do the only thing they seem to know to do. They keep exams going in March and April. But these two are cut short by unrest in the country and schools close early for Auradu. 18th of April, schools reopen. 9th of May, the government instigates attacks on peaceful protesters and school closes for another whole week amidst chaos, death and curfew. Sri Lanka has now turned into a land of mile-long petrol queues, gas queues, 13-hour power cuts, unending citizen protests. The country is officially declared bankrupt, and according to the calculations of Johns Hopkins University, by April 2022, the cost of living had risen by 132%. But guess what? Our smallest, most vulnerable citizens, our children, are expected to keep studying, stay focused on their exams, which, by the way, are now around the corner. The disruptions continue. 17th of May, schools open. 20th of May, close again because of fuel shortages. This brings us to the 23rd of May and the beginning of this current O-level exam. It's been exhausting just recapping this. Can you imagine these children and their families living through it? In fact, it might even be questioned how a government which does not fulfill its basic responsibility by providing children with reasonable access to schooling can then insist that these children sit for exams. Is it really a coincidence that Sri Lanka is one of the highest ranking countries for teenage suicide? Who can we hold accountable for these crimes against our children? Our hearts are with these brave children. These children who have to get up every day and make their way to these exam halls, sometimes without fuel, some of them without food. Children who return to homes without electricity, return to their books with no sense of what their future might actually hold. As parents, educators, citizens of this country, let us come together on behalf of these silent innocents and demand that, in lieu of the unending turmoil and hardship they have had to endure, in lieu of the complete lack of support and stability that we have been able to give them, in lieu of the psychological harm brought about because those in charge have just not done their job, let us demand that no child is left behind. No child is failed at this O-level exam. Our children have suffered enough and struggled silently as the adults in charge of this country have bartered away their futures. Our children are heroes simply for having the courage to turn up at these exams. Not a single one of them from amongst this 517,496 children should be taken out of school or should be penalized any further.